Hey everybody, and welcome back to Scenario Playthrough Series. We have reached the infamous Rainbow Valley, scenario number 20 in the original game. We've got to get 1,000 guests by the end of October year 4. However, we cannot modify the landscaping whatsoever in terms of height, in terms of color, none of that. Nor can we remove any of the trees. And if we add more trees, we can't remove those either. So, we are limited to what we have in between the trees and above ground, or being what we can get below ground on those vertical faces. So we've got a bit of a challenge here, and while the scenario isn't terribly hard to get to 1,000 guests, and if you want to build coasters just sort of all over the place, you can do that relatively easily. But since the idea of this entire channel has been to make things relatively aesthetically pleasing and realistic to an extent, we are going to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach to this. And I did practice a little bit ahead of time, so I did have a couple of test maps that I was working on coaster layouts just to see what fit in between some of these trees and everything, because if we went into this blind into the stream, I fear it would have been kind of a disaster just to get something that looked relatively smooth. So I don't necessarily feel like that was the wrong decision by any means. So at this point, we are going to drop in a couple of flat rides. The carousel is going to stay there. The scrambler is going to move. But at the very least, we have some things to get guests in the door while we start to build our first coaster. And that first coaster is going to be a big wooden coaster here. So this drop over the water was kind of the focal point, at least from my standpoint and where I started. So we went forwards and backwards a little bit. Now it's just kind of a matter of, okay, we have the big drop, so now let's find our way back to wherever the station is meant to be. And on this side, it's just kind of continuing the layout and not hitting a tree. Which is easier said than done, especially when you're interacting or introducing diagonals into the mix. And that's one of the things that I've always said, that in terms of good coaster design and flowy layouts and things like that, you really need to use diagonals in your builds. And we are going to do that to an extent here and try what we can. Again, the big challenge is, since we can't move the trees, we are basically stuck with very limited options for diagonals, since they take up quite a bit more space than just a straight single tile across build. So we have a little bit of a weird lift hill here and station, and the bit between the station and the lift. Because of the trees, we can't have consistent cornering there. We have kind of a little tiny lift hill here that leads to the rest of the thing, and that's not necessarily an issue. The ride pacing is actually pretty okay, I think. It's a little bit of an awkward design, and again, as we try for relative smoothness on these layouts, it's just not my favorite as we get into that, but so it goes. We're a little bit of a balance here, I would say. Now, the other thing, too, is making sure that these rides are long enough. So I don't want to just kind of phone it in and make really short layouts here. So at the very least, I want to have a reasonably sized coaster layout for each of these ones. And we're going to build quite a few coasters in this map, because that's really the key to getting a bunch of people into the space. And especially because we don't really have a lot of, or really any, sections where we have fully flat ground for flat rides and things like that. So I don't love rides up on stilts. I've said that many a time, and I really don't love huge networks of pathways up on stilts. We are kind of forced into that way on this map, but we're going to try and mitigate it as best as we can. But here's our layout. We go out and we cross the river twice and come back into the brake run. The brake run's not very long, but we're also coming into the brakes at a pretty slow pace, so we don't need what you would typically require to slow the train down to a stop, realistically anyway. But I'm pretty happy with this, and it sits over towards the edge of the map, so we're not cutting off any future build space. Although initially the map looks kind of small when you zoom out a little bit, it's actually a fairly gigantic map in terms of build area. You're just limited by what you can do with some of the trees. And there are sections where the trees are a little bit heavier than others, so we have to kind of be mindful of that as we go through. Now with our station that is way off the ground. We've got to get an entrance and an exit through there. So I was messing in with a couple of spots on the other side. Then finally I decided to do a single side entry and exit, which if you've watched some of these, you know that I don't love doing that just because it's not super realistic. It is used, but it's just not an efficient way of doing design. So we try and avoid it as best as we can, but since we really didn't want to have just super high up off the ground pathways, we let it go, and I was fine to just put them on the other side there. But now we have a coaster, and that should get some guests through the gate. I think it's, I don't know what the stats are, I can't remember, but it should be good enough to get some people moving there. So as we continue through, I'm kind of looking for a space to put some other rides just to get some guests through the park, or through the gate. So I leaned towards going over top of the water for a little bit, exactly the thing that I just said that I was not going to do. However, these are temporary rides and should be kind of thought of as such. So we're going to build some of these rides to get guests through the gate to help achieve our goal, while at the same time we are building out our space to make it a little bit nicer, and eventually all these are going to go somewhere else. We're going to go with the natural brown for the color on the coaster, and since it's Rainbow Valley, we might as well make these trains into a rainbow scheme, so we'll stick with that and go through here. So obviously the vertical drop coaster kind of seems well suited here because we have some fairly tight corners that we can do with it, and of course we can go vertically. The other benefit here is that we have these vertical faces, and when you go vertical on the track, you can come out of the ground on a level landscape tile. So that way we can get ourselves a free tunnel here, basically. And this lets us put in a much larger coaster, and one that's going to have some pretty good stats and get some of these guests through the gate. So what we're going to do is start with our little vertical drop there. Because of the terrain, we don't need a huge lift hill, and we can have a medium-sized drop here into a nice big swoopy corner. Kind of reminds me a bit of G5 in Taiwan, where it's the Oblivion layout mirror image, but the drop and everything are fairly high up off the ground, so that turnaround is stupidly high off the ground. And it kind of looks a little bit funny, but works okay. What we want to do here is have our little turnaround here, and then I want another turnaround, including kind of a dive down towards the water. Now, the trouble we're running into here is monetary troubles, which not surprising since we only have the one coaster so far. So ideally I want to drop down here diagonally, then wrap around and get back to the brake area. But the challenge we run into here is we just don't have the money to do it. So there was a good suggestion on stream that I go ahead and just finish the layout, make some money, and then come back and replace it, which we're going to do here in a minute. You can see I'm trying to find some places for flat rides that I can plonk them kind of temporarily and get some guests through the door, which here we go for a little swinging ship. We're going to move both this one and the scrambler soon enough, and then we're also going to get rid of that observation tower. But in the meantime, this gets us started, so at least we have a little bit of money. Now granted, you're not going to make any kind of major bucks with the with the flat rides. You can't charge enough to do it in any kind of reasonable way. You can get close with some of the higher thrill rides, like your shot towers and your top spins and things like that. But from this instance, it's going to be coasters all the way. So we just need to eke out enough money to finish, and we can get there. But since you can see right here, we just kind of completed the layout, and that diving turn right there at the end is going to be pretty darn intense, and we'll probably limit what or how many guests are going to come through this space. But in the end, it does check the box for us on terms of a completed coaster that we can charge a good amount of money for, which is nice because now we have the ability to bring in some more cash. I'm also going back through and adding photo kiosks or photo sections to the coasters, which I really don't like. It's just not my favorite thing. But at the very least, we get $2 a pop for those. And now we've unlocked the shot tower too, so I can drop one of those in as well. This shot tower, I think, is going to move too. But like I said, we're sort of adopting the strategy of let's just go ahead and get things into and onto the map, and then from there we will kind of clean it up and make it a little bit nicer. And actually, we're going to employ that strategy on the next couple of scenarios. Once we get to Thunder Rock, as a little bit of a spoiler alert, we are going to move pretty much everything more than a couple times. So until this point, we've kind of built from, as you come into the park on the right-hand side, I suppose, but eventually we're going to need to expand over to the other side. So I was looking at how you can squeeze some pathways through there and started, but then we moved back to this side and kind of realizing that we need to start to move those flat rides because the next coaster that I want to do sits where those flat rides are going to be. There's a little bit of a plateau up on the very top of the section of the map on this side, so it makes sense to put some flat rides up there. Now, granted, the access to it is not ideal. There's just not a great way to get up there without a super meandering path and one that sits fairly high up off the ground, but we need to get there in some way, so trying a bunch of different options here to try and eliminate having a really long section of sloped pathway. Ideally, we only have two at once, but before a landing, but we know we're not going to be able to do that in this one, so I'm kind of suspending that preference that I typically have. Now, there's some spaces where you can drop a flat ride here, but because of where we put our coaster and all of the other trees, you just can't get a flat ride plus an entrance or exit hut plus the pathway, so that becomes a bit of a challenge. That's one of the things you have to think of, because it's not really just a 3x3 in terms of pathway location or flat ride location. It's a 3x3 plus a 1 in two different spots around that 3x3 plus another 1 on the outside of that, so you have to at minimum have 5 across in some sections to make that work, so you can get in your pathway and your flat ride and your huts and all that sort of thing. But this allows us to get a scrambler up here, it allows us to get a shot tower, and it allows us to get a swinging ship. Not necessarily in the most ideal locations, but at the same time, it works fairly well. And we'll add a little bit of landscaping in the way of fencing and some other things here a little bit later on, just to clean it up a bit and just kind of make it look a little bit nicer, I think. But right now we're sort of in, I don't want to call it survival mode, but it's just a matter of getting the map finished and getting to a point where we can get some of these bigger coasters in, get ourselves some money flowing so we can actually build properly. I think that's really, as the scenarios get a little more challenging, we don't have the luxury that we did at the beginning of these scenario playthroughs, where the money was flowing relatively easily and it was pretty simple just to build whatever you wanted from the outset. But since we don't have that in this instance, we really need to spend some time to make the money to let us build kind of what we want. So we're kind of doing a two-stage build, we'll call it, where we start with things that just get traffic through the door, get people on the rides, get some money in our pocket, and then we can kind of go back and move things and fix things and really make it work out in the end. So here's coaster number 3, and we are doing a looping coaster here. Now, this is a faster go than we usually have in terms of coaster builds. If you've watched any of these other videos, you know that typically we do maybe 3 coasters per map, sometimes a couple more, but not too many. So this is already quite a bit that we have 3 major coasters coming in, but I really wanted to get ahead of it on this one so that we can get the guests through the door and get to the point where we can just kind of clean it up and make it look semi-decent as we get through the rest of the build. So there goes that shot tower, but this allows us to get in a station here and a bit of a curve for a brake run as well. Part of this whole realistic building here, and one of the things that does make this map a little more challenging, is that you end up with some sections here where you need obviously a straight station to get a long enough train, and you need a brake run. And I didn't want to kind of cheap out on realistic brake runs. I want it at least as long as the train is, so we have the ability to do that here. We're a little bit over the water, but not too bad, so I think it works fairly well. So one of the earliest things that I did when I was trying to play around with this map and see what fit where is I actually went into the map in Scenario Editor and just looked at where we had straight sections in between trees, and I kind of marked them all with a land tile marking, and just studied it that way to say, okay, what are the longest sections of straight track that we can have? Because obviously something like a shuttle loop would work really well here, but the problem is you need a huge straight section for that. We don't really have that, but we have enough to do some brake runs and stations, even if they are separated by corners or whatever that may be, S-bends in some instances, which is not the best strategy for it, but that lets us work out where we can kind of fit things and gives us a starting point for the layout itself. So here is our double looping Schwarzkopf with 2 trains, and I think it turned out pretty well. The tunnel in the kind of bottom section there at the end is maybe a little bit forced, but I'm not totally convinced that it's not out of the question for something that you might see from a Schwarzkopf coaster. So I think it works fairly well. And the station and the brake run, or not the brake run, but the queue and the exit pathway work fairly well in this instance. We've got ourselves a little plaza there with that existing tree, and we can build this map, or this coaster anyway, to kind of fit into that very well. So now we've finally generated enough income, or cash flow anyway, that we can go ahead and put this coaster to its final length. So it wasn't lining up here initially as I remember having built it initially, and then I realized I had another straight section in there, so we can fix that up just a little bit, give ourselves that photo booth again, and I think it is worth stating how much money you can make from those photo booths, even though I don't like the look of them. A lot of the guests buy them, so it at least has something to work with for that. So I will take it, and it works out fairly well. So we wanted to do this kind of one more turnaround situation here with that nice big diagonal drop over top of the water. It's a little bit of an awkward finish there with the sort of high up off the ground turns and climbs, and then that little kind of tiny dip and climb into the last little left-right combo there on the corner. The brake run is not huge, but we also don't need a huge brake run because we come in with a relatively normal pace, I suppose. We're not really booking it by the time we get there, and we have just the tiny little short train, so it works out fairly well. We're also not pumping through a bunch of trains on the thing. I think it is just running 2, maybe 3, so it works out just fine. So now we can come back through and take a little bit of a breath, come through and build ourselves a couple of fences and just kind of clean this up a little bit. One of the things when the pathway or the ride is only one tile up off of the ground, you can come in there with a solid fence like the brick or the hedge or the conifer hedge and put that alongside the pathway, and it at least looks a little more like it's on the ground or close to the ground. So that's one of the strategies I wanted to employ, just to try and do a little bit of cleanliness to the pathways, since really there aren't suitable build spaces for making paths on the ground around this whole map. So we just kind of have to wing it a little bit. I just don't want this sort of treetop route all the way around this place. You can see I'm trying a bunch of different things here to get this connection over to those flat rides and also to the wooden coaster without being way too high up off the ground. Trying a bunch of different things, and we'll continue to do some edits on a lot of these, but I want to make this as clean as possible and in a way that actually looks kind of sort of okay. So we're going to make sure our guests don't drown there. And we can also raise that up off of the water. There's no reason why we have to go all the way down to the water, so we can have a little bit of a higher up bridge, which is what we did right here. And I did want to fix this queue and exit, because we can't have just an awkward layout within that space, but I think we're easily adjusting that to make it fit a little bit better. Now we have ourselves a little plaza around that tree there. We've got some food stalls. We have an entrance. We have an exit. And I think we're in a lot better shape. So we can drop in some of those food stalls since we've kind of been neglecting that throughout. And typically I do sort of neglect that in as a whole, I suppose. But we got to toss those in because they do have a pretty good benefit, especially as you get a lot more guests. You need to keep them happy. Now, I did notice I was getting a fair bit of sick guests and throwing up on the paths and dropping some of their trash and everything, even though we do have some trash cans and everything. So I did go through and place the handyman kind of working areas, I suppose. So that at least helps hopefully get it a little bit cleaner so I don't have to pay as much attention to it. I did have the swinging inverter ship, and I looked over there to put some space in there. Initially, when you look at the swinging inverter ship, it's a 2x1 ride. Of course, it takes up 4x1, so you need to pay a little bit more attention there in terms of where the thing can go. It doesn't take up quite as small of a space as it maybe looks initially. The other challenge with it is that you can only build the entrance and the exit on a single side. So really now you are at a 4x2 with the two middle tiles there being used. And then of course you need one more tile after that for each of the entrance and the exit. So you're really at 4x3 when it comes down to it. So it's not quite as small as it looks initially. So we're going to build our fourth coaster here as part of this map, and I believe we end up with 5 coasters in general, so you guys are getting a coaster heavy video today with 4 here at the beginning, but we're going to save the last one, and one of the ones that I think is fairly interesting towards the end. One of the ideas that I had when I first started this map was this seems a really great spot for an Arrow custom looping coaster. So one of the ones that has inversions that are way up off the ground, because then we don't have to worry as much about the trees. Once we get above the trees, we can kind of do whatever we want, and in general that's not super realistic because you don't want something or some element that's just super high up off the ground unless you're talking about an early 80s, 90s Arrow looping coaster where all of the inversions were the same size. They were just adjusted based on speed by height. So if you had a loop, you might raise it way up off the ground after the first drop so that it was the right speed. So that's what we're going to do here. So we got our kind of curving drop here way up into a loop and an Immelman or a Sidewinder as Arrow would have called it. So that lets us at least get started here into a couple of different things. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Anaconda at King's Dominion, RIP, with the loop and the Sidewinder there to start. I used a different coaster there for the corkscrews just because I wanted to see where they fit in there, and it was easier to just use a different ride type than, or ride itself than to kind of work our way over there with the existing ride and then screw around with it for a little bit. So it's just a convenience thing more than anything. So we have a raised section up on top of the hill there. Could have made it a mid-course brake run, but the ride just really isn't long enough for the mid-course. So we have this sort of awkward little hill, which it doesn't necessarily feel super. Here's the little hill that we're going to add in there. It doesn't feel necessarily realistic, but when you look at a lot of these Arrow coasters, they really had some kind of oddball stuff in it. I mean, the little helix turnaround thing in the middle of King's Dominion's Anaconda, it's something that if you built that without having seen it done before in real life, people would say, that's unrealistic. It's just not going to make sense. So I don't feel too bad about doing kind of oddball stuff like that. So we have ourselves a layout. It's on the shorter side, but we still got 4 inversions in there. We got a diagonal brake run, which is just barely long enough. Ideally, it would be longer, but we just don't have the space to do that. We got to get ourselves a pathway over there, which thankfully along the water, it's the lack of trees and the relatively flat sections have kind of allowed us to do a pretty clean pathway over to this space. So that works fairly well. Now it's just a matter of trying to figure out how we get over to this thing. We can cross the ride at the drop, give a little point of interaction there. However, it does look a little silly how high up off the ground it is, but we'll continue to revise that as we go along. But at the very least, we get this thing opened up and getting us some revenue here. So at this point, we're really not going to be worried for money for the rest of the game, and we can continue to just see what is possible to build out into this space. So we're going to go with the Anaconda Legacy theme here. So the red track, the green supports, and the yellow trains, which I think works fairly well. We do now have a top spin that we want to squeeze in here. And there's a couple of flat sections here, but I wanted to stick it way up on top of the mountainside here. The trouble I think we run into here again is the pathway, which just means we have a really high up off the ground pathway, which in general is kind of cool. And in a lot of cases, you see that in kind of nature areas where you have this sort of high up off the ground treetops walk, perhaps. We don't want that the whole way around. Like, I feel like that's a feature of a place, not an everything of a place. So you can see here, I'm not totally satisfied with how some of this is going to work, but we will continue to revise and edit. So that's kind of what next episode is going to be, is more of finish our map. Let's get our 4th or 5th coaster in there. Let's get some more flat rides and some other track rides in there, such as a flume and some other things. Maybe our car ride will make a surprise comeback here, and then it's really just kind of cleaning it up and making it look as good as possible. But that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed these 4 coasters in a fairly challenging setting, and we will be back with the next episode where we will finish out the map. So until next time, thank you all very much for watching, and we will catch you in the next one. Bye now.